Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode is called I Went on Board an Extraterrestrial Craft, 6 Scary True Cases. I love talking about onboard UFO encounters. It's probably the most extensive type of UFO encounter a person can have. It's certainly among the most controversial aspects of this subject. And yet these cases are not only the most interesting, I think, but certainly have the most potential to teach us about what's going on here. And I've got 6 cases that you probably haven't heard before. They're not super well known. They definitely deserve to be. There are a lot of cases of these kinds. And the 6 cases I've chosen today come from a wide variety of locations. They started back in the 1960s up to the 1990s. I've got a case from Argentina, case from Canada, one from France, one from Hungary, and 2 in the United States, one in Alabama and one in Kansas. Some of these are multiple witness cases. There is quite a bit of evidence to support a number of these cases as well. Different types of ETs and just some really extensive cases where people did get to communicate with these ETs. So let's just get started. First case I want to talk about today I call Contact in Calgary. Again, this is not a very well-known case. It occurred on November 17, 1967 in a suburb in Calgary, Alberta, Canada. And this is a single witness case. It's very interesting because while the witness did undergo hypnosis to recall some of the details of his experience, he initially did have missing time, but remembered it spontaneously through a dream. And this is what actually prompted him to undergo hypnosis. It's a really fascinating and unusual case. This case comes from researcher William K. Allen and was also published in an article, Contactee Supplies New Clues to the UFO Mystery, which was written by B. Ann Slate and appeared in the April 1976 issue of UFO Report. The sole witness in this case is 13-year-old David Seawalt. He had gone to visit a friend's home where the 2 boys did some weightlifting, and then at 5:45 p.m., again on November 17, 1967, David began what should have been a 3-minute walk back to his home in Calgary. But of course, that's not what happened. As he was crossing a vacant lot, an empty field, he heard a high-pitched sound coming from above. And looking up, he saw a craft he said was about the size of a house, hovering only maybe 30 to 40 feet overhead. It was silver gray. It had a band of green, yellow, blue, orange, red, and pink lights around the edge, all of which seemed to be blending into each other. So this frightened him. David ran, and the craft began to follow him. Suddenly, as he's running away, it shot an orange beam of light right at him. It came from the bottom of the craft. Dazed and frightened, David continued to run straight home. In fact, he dashed into the front door. He was missing one of his shoes. He ran upstairs and hid under his bed. His sister Angela found him hiding there and saw that his eyes were glazed and he appeared to be in shock. So she shook him, asked him what happened, and he told her, "I've been chased by a flying saucer." It was now 6:30 p.m., so there were over 40 minutes of time that he could not account for. His parents, of course, heard the story and became very concerned, especially because over the next few days, David, who was normally a calm boy, was very nervous and uneasy. So his sister Angela later retraced David's path home, and she found his shoe in the middle of the road. His parents decided to find a UFO researcher, and they located William K. Allen, who, only 3 days after David's encounter, did a recorded interview with him. And as William says, "I taped his description of what he believed happened." And that's where the case sat for about 5 months. Then, on April 21st, 1968, David experienced a very vivid and realistic nightmare, his first dream about this incident, where he basically relived the encounter, Only this time, he did recall being taken on board this craft. At the time he was having this dream, David was thrashing around in bed, and he was woken up by his younger brother, who was concerned about this. And upon awakening, David told his little brother, "Call Dad. Now I know what happened when I was chased by the UFO." So this dream gave David only partial recall of being pulled on board and seeing what he called, quote, monsters. He recalled being physically examined. But later, David did agree to undergo hypnosis by a dental surgeon by the name of Dr. Kolvitz, who used hypnosis in his practice. So they were hoping that he could recall more of what happened. So Dr. Kolvitz first suggested that perhaps David had concocted the whole story as an excuse for coming home late. David hostilely denied this, and in fact his mother confirmed that David had always been home on time. A psychologist by the name of Dr. Masson and the researcher William K. Allen also attended this hypnosis session. And under hypnosis, David was taken back to the incident, and he immediately began to experience an intense fear. In fact, he perspired profusely. He started wringing his hands. His whole body started shaking. He was unable to speak or get past the memory block. Finally, the hypnotist suggested that David try to remember the events as though he was watching TV. This technique worked. David began to remember. He recalled seeing this UFO, trying to run, being struck by the beam of light, and then, as David says, I was sort of in a trance. The beam just brought me up into the ship. Now, inside this craft, he was immediately confronted by two, he says, scary-looking, non-human entities with a sort of reptilian-like appearance. As David says, it has scaly skin. It looked like crocodile skin, sort of rough all over. It has holes for its nose and holes for its ears. It has a slit on its face for a mouth. It's brown. So the beings were very clinical as they undressed David, placed him on a table, and began to examine him. And as David says in his own words, they didn't show any expression. They put me on sort of a cot. He's looking at my body. He's studying it. He took all my clothes off. They're bringing me through a hallway into another room. It has all sorts of bright lights in it. There's another table. They put me on that table. He's lifting my head up. He looks at my hair and my eyes and my nose. They put this other thing over me. It's a grayish color, and they just throw it over me. And then this great big huge orange-colored light comes down and is shown on me. So David could now see that there were actually 4 of these beings, all who looked pretty much the same. Each was about 6 feet tall. He said that they had round heads, 4 fingers on each hand. They did not appear to be wearing anything as far as he could tell. And he said he could hear them talking in a strange language, which sounded like sort of just a buzzing noise to him. He says they took a small gray instrument, sort of like a needle-like device, and stuck it in his arm, but he felt no pain. As he says, I felt, quote, funny, numb. At this point, the examination was over. The beings put his clothes back on. He was taken out from the room, and then, as he says, quote, they beamed me down in the empty lot. So he's thoroughly frightened at this point. His body is still partly numb. His head is swirling, and he ran home as fast as he could. The psychologist, Dr. Masson, learned that David had earlier undergone an appendectomy. This was in 4th grade. And he questioned David about it and learned that one of the doctors was old and had wrinkled skin, and developed this crazy theory that David's hypnotic recall was really just a subconscious memory of his appendectomy. Now, researcher William K. Allen replied, in this way, I can no way concur. I highly doubt that this witness had a hallucination or a fabrication of his prior appendectomy surgery. That really makes no sense whatsoever, and it certainly doesn't explain the missing time. I think that's just a debunking explanation coming from a skeptic who can't quite wrap his mind around the fact that These things do happen. There are a lot of cases coming from all over the world. It's certainly a remarkable case. And now we move to the next one, which is super interesting. I call this one Contact in Loxley. This is a somewhat brief case, but the events surrounding it are truly astonishing. This case occurred on October 17, 1973 in Loxley, Alabama. And what's interesting about this case is that 1973 has been termed the year of the humanoids. There was a very intense wave on that year, particularly towards the end of the year. And this particular event in Loxley had events both before and after it, and really a huge number on the very same day. So this brings a very interesting aspect to this case, but the case itself is also quite unusual, not very well known at all, and I think you'll find it fascinating. October 17, 1973 will probably go down in UFO history as one of the busiest days of UFO activity ever. This was just days after the very famous Pascagoula case in Alabama involving Charlie Hickson and Calvin Parker, and it was a few days before the famous Jeff Greenhaw Falkville, Alabama case, where the police officer came upon a UFO occupant and actually photographed it. So yeah, October 17, something happened that was very profound. And it began on the afternoon of October 17 when two children in Watauga, Tennessee said that they saw a circular copper-colored craft which hovered right above the ground. They said a door opened and a 6-foot-tall being with claw-like hands tried to grab them. Now reportedly, 6 other reports of UFOs came from that area alone at that time. And this is just the beginning. It was a short time later at 4:40 p.m., Teddy Waldrop, age 7, and his friend Kevin Whitehead, age 9, were playing at the St. Joseph School playground in Princeton, Indiana. And this is when they saw a silvery object hovering and then taking off at high acceleration. As Kevin's mother, Miss Charles Whitehead, says, Kevin came home in a near panic. That's how I knew it wasn't just a little boy's joke. So that's a case in Tennessee, another in Indiana. All across the South here in the Midwest, cases were occurring at a rapid rate on October 17. It was around twilight that same night, a man was driving along Highway 82 near Europa, Mississippi, when he said he saw a UFO shaped kind of like an inverted cup. He said it was covered with green-blue flashing lights and was hovering only 3 feet above the road's surface. So the man approached to about 300 feet to this craft when his headlights went out and his car engine died. He says there was another car right behind him who also stopped. At this point, a second identical craft appeared about 60 feet above the first, sending down a beam of light onto the first craft. And it was at this point that he says he saw a gray, scaly humanoid, which he described very strange as looking something like a catfish, had a ridge on its back, weird squirrel-like legs, flippered feet. He saw this thing emerge from the top of the craft. There's not a lot of detail on this case. I definitely have some questions about it. But given that there's so many cases occurring on this night, clearly something profound is happening. Because it was that same night, October 17, 8 p.m., an 11-year-old girl and her cousin were making a scarecrow for Halloween in the front yard of their home in Connorsville, Indiana, when they heard a humming sound coming from above. Looking up, they saw what they first thought was a plane, until suddenly it stopped right above them. The humming sound stopped, and they could now see that this was a craft, a silver-gray saucer with bright lights along the bottom, and they watched as it ejected 3 foggy-looking, quote, things. One of these foggy-looking things began to circle the field. They watched this for about 3 minutes until the object moved to the northeast. Same evening, two men were driving along on Route 23 near Wayne, New Jersey, when they saw a large, round silver craft hovering above a field and then apparently land. So they stopped, exited their cars to watch. One of these gentlemen became scared, drove off, but the other reportedly remained and said that 7 human-looking figures emerged from the craft, 4 men, 3 women, and he says he held a short conversation with them. Again, no further information on most of these cases. But here's another. It was 9 p.m., same night. Paul Brown was driving along U.S. Route 29 near Danielsville, Georgia, when he says a silver UFO dropped down and blocked the road about 300 feet ahead of him. He screeched to a stop and watched as 2 beings, each was about 4.5 feet tall and wearing silver suits and white gloves. He said it looked like they had reddish faces and white hair, but they appeared underneath this craft. Now Paul grabbed his gun, stepped halfway out of his car, and with his gun in hand, pointed it towards them. The beings immediately turned and re-entered the craft, which took off with a whooshing sound. Paul says he fired several shots at the craft with no apparent effect other than to apparently chase this craft away. More cases on this night. It's crazy. Later that evening, a woman from Pikesville, Maryland, said she was woken up by a loud explosion followed by a humming noise, and walking out onto her front porch, she saw a red transparent object about 15 feet long, 8 feet high. It had a transparent bubble on top, and she could see a humanoid figure standing up inside of it. And there are more reports. The crew of an offshore oil platform in Crowley, Louisiana, said that they saw an object hovering about 1,000 feet overhead. It then descended to about 100 feet, which caused the platform's entire electrical system to fail. 10 other reports from Powhatan, Louisiana, came in of a multicolored object, which was hovering and gliding. There were many other reports, but the one I really want to talk about occurred to a gentleman by the name of Clarence Ray Patterson. He's a 31-year-old electrician, and it was about 15 minutes before midnight, October 17. He was driving along Interstate 10. This is near Loxley, again, Loxley, Alabama. And he was driving along Interstate 10 near the Loxley exit when he noticed a, quote, unidentified spaceship. He said it was cigar-shaped, had a green light, it was hovering over his pickup truck, and it sent down this beam of light onto his truck. And the next thing he knew, he found himself and his pickup truck inside the object. He's still sitting in his pickup truck at this point. Now his memory did go in and out, but he recalled seeing 6 beings, which he said had claw-like hands. He says they were about his height or perhaps a little shorter. They walked very stiffly, and in fact he had the impression that they might be robotic. He said his body felt paralyzed, numb. He did smell a sort of sulfur odor. And he says they pulled him from his truck, and he found himself being examined by these beings. He had a distinct impression that they were reading his mind telepathically, and that's really all he could recall. The next thing he knew, he was back on the highway. But it was now a half hour later, and his truck was in a different location. It was now on State Road 297 in Escambia County, Florida, which is about 29 miles away from where he was taken, and about 10 miles from his home at 2016 West Godfrey Street in Pensacola. So he drove home. He immediately phoned the police. He was put in touch with Police Sergeant Lucien Mitchell, who questioned him about his experience. And, as Sergeant Mitchell says in his own words, Patterson became very emotional and started crying. He told me that I thought he was some kind of nut, and that he refused to tell this story again to anyone. I might add, when Patterson was relating this incident to me, he was very nervous and said from the beginning of the interview that no one would believe him. But Officer Mitchell took the report seriously, and as it turned out, no less than 7 police officers in Escambia County had reported seeing UFOs between 3:40 and 5 a.m. that same evening, hovering just south of Pensacola Beach. So what's so amazing about Clarence Patterson's experience here is that it is just one of more than 24 that occurred in the US on that same day, and many of them involving humanoids. Now, a good number of these cases were covered in the book The Year of the Humanoids by David Webb. What an amazing case that was. Given that there were so many other cases occurring the same exact day, that raises all kinds of questions. I mean, it's almost undeniable that something was going on that day. How can so many people be reporting sightings and landings and humanoids on one day? It's crazy. And now we move to the next case, which is probably the best known of this little compilation of 6 cases. And this one you may have heard before, but I don't know if you've heard of all of the events surrounding it. I thought it was an important case, that's why I wanted to present it to you today. And I call it Contact in Venado Tuerto. This is in September of 1978. A number of events in the beginning of September, again in Venado Tuerto, Argentina. And the main case is a single witness case. There's a lot of evidence to support this case, particularly because of the events that occurred both before and after it. This case is one of Argentina's better known encounters, but what is not as well known are the many cases that are connected to it. It actually involves a series of amazing close encounters. And one of the first occurred to a gentleman by the name of Carlos A. Helian. He's a carpenter. It was around 4:30 a.m. on September 3rd, 1978, that Carlos was driving along National Route 8. This is around the 350-kilometer mark, which you can see here, which perhaps significantly is not far from a large water and power plant. We do know UFOs are attracted to installations. At any rate, to his left, Carlos saw about 2 kilometers away a very bright light over an empty field. And as he drove closer, he saw that there were no less than 7 large, glowing, disc-shaped craft landed on the ground in this field. He said they appeared to have concave bottoms, semi-spherical domes on top. They were quite large, about 12 meters in diameter. They were all emitting an intense bright light, which lit up the environment around them like daylight. But even more amazing, he observed 2 humanoid figures moving around them, and they appeared to be performing various tasks. Now, Carlos's car was now close enough that he could see these beings pretty good. He says they were very tall, over 2 meters in height, at least 6 feet, and they were wearing white coveralls with dark helmets. They were moving very slowly around. He saw one of them bend down, pick something up off the ground and give it to the other humanoid. But he's still driving, so as he's driving by them, one of these craft rose vertically upwards to a height of about 50 meters, 150 feet. He says it then began to move like a pendulum. At this time it was emitting bright red and violet lights. Carlos continued driving just a short distance when this craft suddenly zoomed right towards him and shone 2 powerful beams of light on his car, which immediately began to lose both power and speed. And for the next 500 to 600 meters, this disc followed him, keeping these beams of light trained on his car, until suddenly darting back to its original location. Carlos, who kept driving, understandably, he was quite frightened. This craft moves off, and he tried to keep his eye on it, but soon trees and structures hid this craft from his view. And that was his experience. But it was a case that occurred 3 days later in the same general area that would later become world famous. In fact, this case was researched by Jacques Vallée and would appear in his book Confrontations. The witness is 12-year-old Juan Oscar Perez, and it was around 6:45 a.m. on September 6, 1978, Juan had been sent outside to do his chores, which involved gathering a herd of horses for his family. This was a foggy morning. He was riding home on his horse when he felt something flying overhead. Shortly later, he did see several objects appear, maneuvering overhead, emitting powerful beams of colored light. This caused the horses to panic and gallop away. In fact, Juan could barely control his own horse, and quite frightened, he fled home. Once at home, his father was not happy and sent him back out again to find the horses. So that's what Juan did. He went back out on his horse. He returned to the field where the horses had been, and this time he came upon a large round object with a dome on top, windows around the edge, basically a classic flying saucer. It says it was about 12 meters in diameter, 36 feet or so. And as he approached, a door opened in this craft, a little ladder retracted out, and a 7-foot tall humanoid wearing a silver gray uniform and a cylindrical helmet emerged out of this door. He says a hose-like tube went from this being's suit back to inside the ship, and this being began speaking a strange language and used gestures and actually invited Juan inside this craft. Juan was intrigued. He accepted the invitation. In fact, he tied his horse to this ladder that came out of the craft and climbed up inside. And as Juan says, it was like a hut, but with a tall, round dome. I wanted to go in. Lights of many colors lit up. As the horse was scared, I tied him to the huge ladder that came out, which I remember was gray and very cold. So Juan had no experience with UFOs. He compared this to a hut. At any rate, Juan climbed inside. The being followed him. Juan could see now that this being was wearing what looked like metallic gloves. He noticed several things in the interior of the craft. He saw panels with what looked like buttons on them. He saw some tables. He saw a smaller robotic-looking being, only about 4 feet tall, which had sort of tools at the end of its arms or extremities, what looked like wheels for a base, and was sampling bones that looked like they came from a horse or a cow. He was putting them in containers. In fact, a week earlier, Juan's father had found a dead cow in the fields near their home. Now, Juan tried to touch the being several times, but he says it was weird because each time he was thwarted by an invisible barrier of some kind. Now, the experience ended abruptly when the taller being pressed a button which caused the ladder to start to retract back into the craft. So Juan, seeing this, quickly rushed back down the ladder to untie his horse. The taller being followed. Juan asked this taller being if he could keep one of the gloves. And apparently this request was granted because this being took off a glove and handed it to Juan. Now, at this point, Juan could see that this being's hand was sort of greenish in color with what looked like bluish nails at the tip. At this point, the taller being pricked Juan's arm, which he perceived as sort of a blood sample being taken. At any rate, Juan jumped on his horse at this point and began to gallop home with the glove still in his possession. But he had only gone a very short distance when he saw 2 objects emerge from this landed craft and immediately began to follow him. One of these emitted a small spherical device which swept down right above Juan and sucked the glove back up, seemingly with magnetic force, right up into it. Juan then heard the craft behind him emitting a loud, piercing hum, and he saw it take off and disappear into the sky. Now, this whole case was later the subject of a documentary called Witness of Another World, made in 2019. And as Juan says, after the age of 12, my life changed. What happened to me is something that even today I can't understand. For a long time, I carried the fear with me. Now, it turns out that Juan's mother had also had a profound encounter with a UFO when she was 12, and following that, had very strong premonitions throughout her life. And the same thing happened to Carlos. He started having all kinds of dreams that would come true, he did have a dream that an asteroid would come near Earth and cause great floods. So this is a theme we see again in a lot of contactee accounts. A very strange and unique case, quite incredible. But it was just 3 days earlier that someone else had that encounter, which provides a level of corroboration, as does an encounter which occurred 2 days after Juan's, again in Venado Tuerto. This third case occurred again 2 days later at 3:37 a.m., and the witness in this case is 16-year-old Roberto Francisco Torres. He was riding his bike along Belgrano Street, again in Venado Tuerto. He was on his way to his place of employment, a bakery. He had to get there very early. And he had just reached the intersection of Belgrano and Mitre, which you can see here, when he noticed that the lighted store signs were becoming extinguished. And at the same time, the area around him became very brightly illuminated from an object above him, which was sending down a huge beam of light. So, the witness in this case, Roberto, says he felt a strong sensation of intense heat coming from it. And looking up, he saw an oval-shaped craft with a dome on top. It was about 10 meters wide, he said, hovering 50 meters overhead. He said the base of the craft was glowing bright red. It had portholes all around the edge of it, and it was also emitting this bright white light. This craft was rocking smoothly back and forth. Both surprised and terrified, Roberto began riding his bike away as fast as he could, while at the same time yelling at the top of his lungs for somebody to come out and help him. It was very early. Nobody came out until Roberto actually arrived at the bakery, and the owner there saw Roberto's frightened face. Now, a later investigation revealed something very interesting. The Water Electric Power Company had registered a blackout precisely at 3:37 a.m., which is the exact time of Roberto's sighting. A very unusual case, I think, by even ufological standards. Such a shame that the witness wasn't able to keep that ET artifact, this glove, which could have been, the smoking gun evidence. This sort of thing does turn up in a number of cases. People have an artifact and then they don't. That happened in the Betty and Barney Hill case. She was about to take a book off board the craft when the ETs changed their mind. That looks like what happened here. At any rate, it's a pretty compelling case with so many cases occurring around that time in that area. Pretty well-known case, very well investigated, and certainly one that adds to our knowledge of what's going on here. And now we move to another case which is virtually unknown. I call this one Contact in Summercourt. This occurred on July 10, 1983 in Summercourt, France. This is in the Haute-Marne area. This is a very rural area, but a really amazing case involving a single witness to a certain extent, though his whole family did see UFOs. And wow, this poor witness, he was really traumatized by his encounter, as we shall see. I really feel for the witness in this case, Stefan Gasparovic. He was affected quite profoundly by his encounter. In fact, it was on July 8th through the 9th that Stefan, a 45-year-old fireman, woodworker, an employee at a nearby furniture factory, decided to go camping with his family and a neighbor on the Summercourt Plateau, not far from their home in Summercourt. This is in eastern France. He has 6 children, by the way. So they're all camping, and it was around 3 a.m. when he observed a blindingly bright, quote, ball of fire overhead. He said it had a kind of funnel at the base, was pretty low in the sky, about 600 feet, 200 meters. He saw it 3 times that night, so this is quite unusual. And it returned again the next night. They were still out there camping, and he saw it. In fact, it affected him so profoundly, and it scared his family, that they decided to cut their camping trip short. But Stefan was very curious, so the next night, on Sunday, July 10th, he decided to return alone to the Semmercourt Plateau, and this time he took a pair of binoculars with him. It was around 10 p.m. that this strange glowing object made a third appearance. But this time, instead of hovering overhead at about 600 feet, it came zooming down straight for him. And he could now see that this sphere was about 3 meters wide, had a luminous upper section, and it was actually a craft because inside he could see 3 figures, very short, no taller than 3 feet. He said that they were wearing jumpsuits which looked green in color. It absolutely terrified him. He threw himself to the ground. He lay flat on his stomach, and he says this object hung just over him when suddenly he felt himself being drawn upwards. As Stefan says, I was lying in the alfalfa field, and I saw this ball of fire which suddenly came to a stop with a strange noise directly above me. My whole body was sucked up as if by a vacuum cleaner. I was sucked up by it. After that, I didn't remember much more. It all goes black. I felt a violent gust of wind and roared. I don't know how long it lasted, but it went very quickly. So meanwhile, Stefan's family was becoming very concerned. Midnight had arrived and Stefan still had not returned from his outing. So they went out looking for him, and they became even more concerned when they found his car with the doors open, but there was no sign of Stefan. So they returned home. It was now around a half hour after midnight, and to their shock, Stefan was there at the house. And after being pulled up into this craft, he had only partial recall of what happened, but he does remember some of it. He said it was very dark inside, very warm. He could hear this strange sort of tut-tut-tut noise. He felt movement, but his next memory was being let go. As Stefan says, finally, I was dropped from a height of 2 meters into a field 6 kilometers away. So yeah, he was dropped off in a different location. He walked home from there, and his eldest son, Thierry, says, and I quote, he lay dazed on his bed and did not recognize anyone. He mumbled a number of incoherent sentences and kept repeating, those little guys are fat and ugly and they have spots. His daughter Christine verifies this. She's 17 years old, and as she says, and again I quote, Papa was sitting on the bed with wild and vacant eyes. He was murmuring, you will never believe me. He kept talking about, quote, the little ones with pointed ears. In short, he frightened us terribly. And as Stefan's wife says, I have never seen him like this. And in fact, Stefan was so disoriented, so traumatized, he didn't know his own name. He started saying he was a Spaniard with a completely different name, Ivan Azard. And suddenly, at 2 a.m., he jumps up, and in this weird trance, he marches outside and starts shouting, they are up there, and I am going to them. And in fact, looking outside, they could see this object still hovering over the Semmercourt Plateau. They were bewildered, concerned, afraid. They dragged him back inside, called an ambulance, and had him taken to the local hospital. Now going outside when the ambulance arrived, Stefan's wife and his eldest son Thierry, and the driver of the ambulance, Francis Wien, all could still see this yellow-orange ball hanging above the Semmercourt Plateau. And later it was discovered that other people in the area had also seen this strange light. They went up there, his family, and they did find a circular landing trace. Now at the hospital, Stefan was diagnosed with some eye trouble, light sensitivity, of course memory loss. They found bruises on his body. He wandered around in a daze for quite some time, kept saying that he had spoken to, quote, fat, ugly little men with pointed ears. They kept him in the hospital for about 10 days, thankfully making a full recovery, at least physically. Emotionally, he remained traumatized, and as he says, he will, quote, never again set foot on that damned mountain. That's the kind of case that is truly undeniable. Yes, it is a single witness case, but you have his whole family seeing UFOs, his whole family, a large family, confirming what he went through in terms of the trauma, physiological evidence, landing trace evidence. Clearly something quite unusual happened. And we even have the ambulance driver seeing the UFO. Really amazing case. It's a shame he can't remember more of what happened to him. But on the other hand, he did remember it consciously without the aid of hypnosis, and I think that's significant. And now we move to another case, which is equally compelling, if not more so, because this does involve two witnesses who were both taken on board at the same time. I call this one Contact in Goodland. This occurred on November 7, 1989 in Goodland, Kansas. This case was very thoroughly researched. It involves two women who were driving along a highway late at night, had missing time, finally elected to go under hypnosis and independently recalled many details that pretty much matched perfectly. So it's a really important case. It shows that hypnosis does work in recalling events because it's almost impossible for people to recall the same darn details, matching up almost perfectly. Now this case from John Carpenter is amazing. This was published in the 1991 Volume 3 issue of the Journal of UFO Studies. And it's my favorite case in this compilation. This is an amazing double witness case. The witnesses are anonymous, known only as Susan and Jennifer. At the time of this experience, Susan was a 42-year-old businesswoman, married with two children, 17 and 21. She had no interest or prior knowledge in UFOs. And her friend Jennifer was a 49-year-old freelance photographer. She had two adult stepchildren, and like Susan, had never really given much thought to UFOs. They had attended a convention in Aspen, Colorado, and were driving from Aspen to their homes in St. Louis, Missouri. It was around 11:40 p.m., again on November 7, 1989, as they left a gas station in Flagler, Colorado, and were heading east on Interstate 70 towards Goodland, Kansas, about 72 miles away, where they planned to stop for the night at a motel. But almost immediately after getting on Interstate 70, they both simultaneously noticed a bright object ahead of them on the highway to the side, and it was flashing colored lights. And it stayed off in the distance, but seemed to pace their car for the next hour. In fact, they pulled off the road several times to look at it because of its unusual appearance. But suddenly at 12:40 p.m., after they had just pulled over and got back on the road again, this light zoomed towards them, stopping at a distance of only about 100 feet, hovering over this field to the right. It sent down a cone of colored light, pastel pinks, blues, lavender. They also noticed weird, quote, black waves, kind of like heat waves, which were visible on the lower part of the windshield. Both were very excited, a little scared by the sight of this strange object so close. At this point, they were just outside of Goodland, Kansas. But the next thing they knew, their mood had changed from being excited to exhausted and irritated. They immediately stopped at a rest stop, were surprised to find that the bathrooms were closed. At this point, they could still see the UFO, now off some distance. So they continued driving. The UFO disappeared. They arrived at a motel in Goodland, but it was now 2:30 a.m. It was not at first obvious to them that they were missing about an hour of time. Both felt physically ill. Jennifer was a little bit flushed, and Susan, she says she felt like, quote, death warmed over. So it was the next morning that they went over this and realized that something very odd had occurred, because although 3 hours had elapsed during this trip, the gas gauge on their car showed that only an hour's worth of gas had been used. I mean, this is only a 72-mile trip, which took 3 hours, even though their speed was about 75 miles per hour. They also noticed a weird black streak on the sun visor that hadn't been there before. Following this experience, Jennifer began suffering from some unexplained nosebleeds. Both felt quite anxious and irritable. They had insomnia. So, it was about 2 weeks later, after researching their experience and looking into this subject of UFOs, that they decided that they were going to go under hypnosis. Now, these sessions were done separately, and what they recalled is very interesting. Because Jennifer recalled seeing the UFO as she had seen it consciously, but then she recalled being pulled out of the car. As she says, "I'm behind it, looking down at an angle." Very quickly, she watched their car shrink down to a tiny size, and looking up, she saw that she was approaching this craft. It had rounded portholes, and suddenly she found herself inside this rounded room illuminated with an orange light. And as Jennifer says, there's no corners in this room. It's round, kind of like a frisbee. The various windows are dark, but when you look out of them, you can see bright lights. You can see all the stars. The heavens are just full of them. I'm looking out the windows, and it's the Earth. We're high. Also, she noticed several figures surrounding her, 5.5-foot tall beings with grayish skin, large hairless heads, pointy chins, huge, slanted dark eyes. She said they had no real nose or mouth. Very pale skin. They did not appear to be dressed. She couldn't tell for sure. She did notice that they had 4 long fingers, and some, she said, had what looked like suction cups on their fingers. She said that they started communicating with her telepathically, took her to another larger room, placed her on this floating table. She saw this panel of what looked like colored lights. She noticed that the room had a central column in it. So this is what Jennifer initially recalled. And meanwhile, Susan, going under hypnosis, recalled essentially the same thing. She saw the UFO suddenly approach, their car get brighter, and the next thing she knows, she's being pulled from the car. And like Jennifer, she's watching it get smaller and smaller below her. And as she says, as she's being pulled up, it's real light. We don't weigh much. It's more like floating. And like Jennifer, she found herself in a room, which, as Susan says, is, quote, like a circle. Susan said she saw windows around the sides, she could see stars outside, and, like Jennifer, she saw the Earth itself. As Susan says, looking out one of the windows, a blue globe, like pictures you might see of planets, but it's not a picture, it's real pretty. She was taken to a larger room. She saw a floating table near the center. In the middle of this room was a large column. She saw what looked like cabinets in the wall. She saw what looked like hieroglyphic symbols on the wall. And, of course, she saw these beings and described them just like Jennifer had described them. As Susan says, they're more slender. They have really dark, huge eyes, slanted eyes. The eyes are enormous and take over the face. Now, Jennifer had said that these beings moved around by gliding, and Susan said the same thing. They sort of glided around rather than walking. She did notice that one of the beings was quite a bit taller than the others. Now, Jennifer said that the beings seemed very friendly, and they wanted to examine her. And as Jennifer says, they were reassuring us. We should not be afraid. They're not going to hurt us. They came over and patted my hand. That made me feel comfortable. They're not going to hurt us. And Susan said the same thing. As Susan says, they seem to be communicating that they mean us no harm. They try to calm me. Somebody keeps rubbing my head with those hands. They pass this hand over Jennifer's forehead, which seems either to calm her or sedate her. She's lying on a narrow table covered with some type of white material. Now, it looked to Susan like Jennifer was undergoing some type of procedure. They seemed to show a special interest in Jennifer's hands. Susan also saw that they were placing something inside of Jennifer's nose. And this is exactly what Susan recalled as well. Now, Susan was communicating with them to a certain extent, and they were explaining what they were doing. As Susan says, they were working for the advancement of something about genetic coding. It is an agreement we had before our birth, and it is for the advancement of the species and the advancement of planet Earth. Jennifer also recalls, like Susan, that the beings were examining her hands. She watched a panel of lights light up. She wasn't able to see Susan, which is also what Susan recalled. She could see Jennifer, but Jennifer couldn't see her. And as Jennifer says, I don't remember anything else, just that I was hooked up for a span of time. I think I asked, "What are you going to do to me?" They said they needed to have more information about what my chemistry is all about. Something was being energized through my system when they were taking all these tests, taking information from me, from my body chemistry. Now, Susan recalls being given a thick liquid to drink, and the next thing both women recall is being floated back down to their car. And as Jennifer says, it's as if we're just kind of descending. We're floating through the sky, then gently coming down to earth. They led us out to the right of the car. Jennifer remembers thinking to herself, I was somewhere I've never been before, nor have I ever seen anything like this before. And as Susan says, one of the aliens does something with his hands, a movement with his hands, and we seem to be on our way back to the car. We don't fall, we come down faster, we're back into the car. They are seeing that we get back into the car. They wave their hands over our foreheads, and we don't remember. So at this point, both women say that their memories left them. After undergoing hypnosis, both Susan and Jennifer were shocked by their detailed recall, but both did feel an enormous sense of relief. Neither felt that the experience was bad. It was overall a positive experience for them. As Susan says, I can honestly say what happened to me was a positive experience. And I can say that because I have grown from it. I think I am a much better person for having had my little world shattered and for opening up to new possibilities of what this life might be all about. How interesting is that? I wonder how many people have this kind of experience and never seek help, never go under hypnosis. But they did, and they both recall being pulled on board, seeing the car a tiny little dot below them, being placed on tables, physically examined. Both remember looking out the window and seeing the earth. Both remember seeing pretty much the same kinds of ETs, everything from the way they looked, the way they were dressed, the way they moved. All of it matches up. It's a really compelling case. And now we move to another one, which is super interesting. Like many onboard experiences, this is a single witness case. I call this one Contact in Debrecen. This occurred in December of 1990 in Debrecen, Hungary. And it's a really interesting case because the area where it occurred is the same location for a number of other UFO incidents, which I've actually covered on previous episodes. But this one is an onboard encounter involving a very unusual humanoid. And while he doesn't remember a lot of what happened, it's certainly an important case. This final case comes from respected Hungarian researcher Gabor Tarkali, and it was published in the July-August 1993 issue of the Q-Forn Bulletin. The main witness is a former geography teacher, now an artist, by the name of Gabor Molnar. And it was around 10:30 p.m. as Gabor was driving along Highway 35 after visiting his child in the hospital at Debrecen. He was heading home. He had just driven past the town of Joza when something very strange happened. And I'll just let Gabor describe it in his own words. As he says, my car stopped. I did not know why. And then the engine stopped also. I remember a little green being stood facing me at the roadside. His eyes were large, out of proportion. What happened after that, I do not know. Only some fragments of memory remained in my mind. I have dim recollections of a room with several windows, and I lay on something. I suppose I was examined. I remember green beings bent over me who looked at me with large eyes that had no pupils. I do not know what they did with me or how much time I spent with them. When I recovered, I was sitting in my car. The car was in the middle of the road at an angle facing Debrecen in the opposite direction. I do not know the exact time. I started my car and I came home. So following this encounter, Gabor said he started to suffer from headaches. He also noticed something interesting. His style of painting changed dramatically. Prior to this encounter, he was painting mostly portraits and landscapes. But afterwards, he began producing paintings of strange foreign landscapes, which seemed to be on other planets. And while painting, this is when he would have vivid flashbacks of seeing these little green entities and being on the ship and being examined. So at first he told nobody about his encounter except his wife, who was shocked and skeptical. But one day he did tell his friend, Peter Tarksey, who it turns out is a reporter, an art aficionado who does have a strong interest in UFOs. And Gabor told him, "Peter, a very strange thing happened to me. Please do not laugh if I tell you." Thankfully, Peter did not laugh. Gabor shared his story. Peter absolutely believed him, and this is what led to the case being officially investigated. And as Peter says, Gabor Molnar has had a good reputation, but his new paintings greatly surprised his artistic friends too. Now, Gabor himself says that he never believed in UFOs before his encounter, but of course now he does. As Gabor says, "Now I believe in UFOs, without any doubt, and I am willing to be taken again. I will never forget that night." There you go, another case of a person being taken on board. I like this case because the main investigator, Gabor Tarkali, is a very thorough researcher. Appears to be an absolute legitimate case. It fits the pattern we see in so many other cases. Said it before, I think these kinds of events are far more common than most people realize. As I've said in previous episodes, there was a study done in 1991 by the Roper organization, which does polling, and they did a whole survey on this and found that as many as 1 in 50 people show the markers of being a UFO contactee. Problem is, most people don't talk about it. So this is one of the reasons I do this research and these episodes, is because there's a lot of you guys out there who've had this experience. I know a lot of you watching have had these experiences. So this is a subject that deserves truth and transparency, deserves to be far better known than it is. So, it's an important subject. I think if everyone knew that we are not alone in this universe, it would change the way people think and act, and we might come together instead of having all these wars and division and all the problems that are besetting humanity at this current time. At any rate, it's also just darn interesting. So that's it for today. Thank you guys for watching. I love these onboard encounters. They're so interesting. I think these cases do show how it can be quite difficult, quite traumatic and scary for people to undergo. But I also find it interesting that a good number of these witnesses said that, this experience was benevolent. Certainly not all. The man from France, he clearly did not like this experience. But the Goodland, Kansas case, the Hungary case, both said that they would welcome further contact. So certainly an interesting detail. Once again, thank you. I truly appreciate you guys watching. Until next time, keep your eyes on the skies. Keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Keep asking those hard questions. But most important of all, keep having fun. I think that's why we're here, to learn and have fun. So I will see you next Friday. Bye for now.